This is Dennis Pendleton, and this is an advanced lesson in watercolor painting. And by advanced, it simply means that you should have some understanding of colors and values and shapes and edges and color mixing, and been painting for a while. We're going to cover a lot in this video. It's a painting that I did when I lived in Steamboat Springs. And we'll be looking at this painting in regards to colors and values and shapes and edges and effective use of white paper and brushwork and rich darks and borders and color temperature and artistic decisions. It's really a lot to cover. So let's get started. Let's first talk about colors. When I mixed the colors for this painting, I did not stir them up. That's one of the things I talk about in the video on mixing colors. I didn't stir them up on the palette, and I didn't stir them up on the watercolor paper. I just barely pushed the colors together. That way you can see the different components of the mixture. Here's an example. On this cow's face, right through here, you can see cerulean blue, and then you can see mineral violet, and then you can see the two as they bled together on the paper. There's examples up here in the trees too. Some areas where I used pure lemon yellow, other areas where I used olive green, other areas where those colors are mixed on the paper. And some of these greens were also mixed with cerulean blue and lemon yellow and cadmium yellow. Some of the darker greens up here were mixed with olive green and a darker green like perylene green, or a dark blue like ultramarine blue. So as you come down into the treetops here, you can see some interesting color mixtures. It starts here with cool colors of violets and blues for shadows on the aspens, and then as it comes down, the aspens warm up and there's some warm grays and sienna and a little bit of cobalt violet in there in some of those trees. And on the cows themselves, the colors were burnt sienna and raw sienna and yellow ochre, and some of those colors were mixed right on the paper, like here where I put down burnt sienna, let a little bit of red run into it, and then come up here for raw sienna and yellow ochre on the top, and those colors bled together right on the paper. There's examples in the trees, like over here. Again, this is a tree that's in the background, so I used some cooler colors on it. There's cerulean blue in there, cobalt violet, gray mixed with cerulean blue and red. And in the trees here in the front, I used warmer colors, and you can see some yellow ochre, a warmer gray, and some little bits of burnt sienna and burnt umber on there. And the greens up here, the reflections or the shadow shapes on the treetops, even those are a little bit warmer green, where there's a little more yellow than blue in those mixtures. In the tops of the trees, I used a lot of warm colors. It's mixtures of green, but the yellow dominates, and the blue, there isn't as much blue in there. So you get warmer greens, yellow greens, and just a warmer sense through the top of the trees. And I did that because I wanted to show the sunlight coming through there. Now as you come down into the painting, down into the foreground, the grass down here is a much cooler green. There's more blue than yellow in the mixture. And there's cerulean blue, there's cobalt blue, and ultramarine blue, as well as lemon yellow and cadmium yellow. Predominantly lemon yellow, because I wanted the grass to be a cooler color. And the reason is I wanted warm colors on the top, cool colors down here in the grass, so that they wouldn't be the same, so that there would be a difference. Now typically you use warm colors in the closest part of the painting, which would be the foreground, but I reversed that in this case, And it was just an artistic decision, just something that I wanted to do that I thought would work well with painting. Now, if you take one of the aspen trees, like this one right here, you can see their green colors up here. That's just a reflection from the leaves. As it comes down, the colors warm up. There's more browns, more earth tones with burnt sienna, raw sienna. You can see some yellow ochre in there. And it comes down and it just remains warm colors right down to the bottom of the painting. Now, there's examples back in here where the tops of the aspen tree has a lot of cool colors on it, and that would be violets and blues, and then it comes down and gets a little bit warmer. So it's a nice mixture of warm and cool colors in these aspen trees. This one is warmer with warmer grays in it. Some of these back here in the distance have more cool colors on them with blues and blue violets. And in the cows themselves, like on the face of this one, for example, right around the mouth right here and the nose is a real warm shade of red and violet and yellow ochre. That's so that will project out a little bit further. And then as his face drops back, or her face drops back, there are cool colors through here and a little bit of warmer colors in some of the forehead. And you can see that in all these cows. This area right here, which I wanted to jump forward a little bit, is a warmer kind of a pink color made with yellow ochre and cobalt violet. Same way on this cow right here. Now this has some warm areas around his eyes, but it's a nice combination of warm and cool colors. Now this cow over here on the very edge, for example, is further away, so her whole face is much warmer. Much cooler. So it has blues and violets in it. Now let's talk about values. Right here, you have the darkest dark value all the way to black, which incidentally is not black out of the tube. It's mixed with a dark blue and a dark brown. In this case, ultramarine blue and burnt umber. That way you can see a little bit of the blue in the mixture and a little bit of the brown, and to me it's just that much more interesting. But with values, you have the darkest dark right here against a very, very light area in this cow's face. So you have a darkest dark against the lightest light, and that's a way to use values to command a lot of attention in one area. And you can see it's the same thing with this cow's face. The dark coming in this side, the warm colors over here, but again it's a dark dark against a light light. And there should be a good value range throughout a painting like this. And it goes all the way from white paper in some of these aspens and in the faces of the cows, all the way to a real rich dark like this, the dark back here between the aspen trees and over here, and some of the darks up here in the leaves. Now down here in the foreground, there's a dark shape that runs pretty much across the bottom of the painting. And what that does is just keeps you in the painting, and that dark area helps the ground and the grass come forward a little bit. Now, if you look at some of these trees in the background, they're darker values here, here, over here. They're darker values than the aspen trees right here in the front, the bigger ones. But they're also cooler colors. So it's a combination of darker values and cooler colors that move those trees kind of into the distance. Also, they're just smaller and they're overlapped by things like the cows. Now, there should be a value range. You can look at something like this tree right here. There's white paper, there's very light values in the cast shadows. Down the shadow side of this tree, it gets into a middle value. Now these knots on the trees, like this right here and this right here, if they get too dark, they'll just look like spots in the painting. So those aren't as dark as some of these values over here. So that's an example of just controlling the values in the paintings. Now each of the cows has different values around it. Take this one for example. There's middle value in the grass down here. There's some white areas in the trees around him, white areas in her face, and then some darker shapes coming down between the trees and darker shapes on some of the trees that bring that face out even more. I used values in this painting to play up certain areas, like this group of cows right here and this one have a little bit more importance than the ones way out here on the edges. And part of that is because there's more value contrast in these. There's also more detail and more rich colors. The trees on the sides, like these over here and these here, are more in middle values, and then the lightest values on the trees are here towards the center of the painting. And that's to kind of close the painting in so you spend more time viewing in this area right here. Now also, if you look at the corners of the paintings, like this one up here, how that's really a dark area of the painting, same thing over here. The grass gets a little bit darker in these corners. And what that does is that kind of pulls you into the painting and keeps you there. One of my favorite artists, Victor Higgins, who was one of the early Taos painters, was a master at doing this in his paintings. And if you want to look at one of them, a good example would be his painting called Winter Funeral. And that's by Victor Higgins. Now let's talk about shapes. If you can see your subject matter in terms of shapes, it cuts down the amount of detail that you feel like you need in the painting. So if you look across the top of the painting up here, I considered all this area with the leaves and the sunlight coming through the trees and the little branches. I considered that all as one shape and tried to think of it that way and paint it that way. So it creates kind of an umbrella effect, over the rest of the painting, with the corners coming in. And if that is considered and painted as one shape, it'll simplify things quite a bit, and you don't have to put as much detail in it. Now, if you think of these big aspens here in the front as this group right here as one shape, it connects the bottom border and the top border. And also, if you think of that as one shape, it's easier to get the colors on there, and it's much easier to leave out a lot of detail. Each of the cows themselves could be considered a shape, but if you look at this group right here, I considered that one shape, even though there's 4 or 5 different cow faces on there and different bodies. But I tried to create that as one shape, kind of a group, rather than having them scattered all over the place. And I did the same thing here. These cows have less detail because they're a little bit further away from this part of the painting. But if I think of those as a group and as a shape, then it's easier to control it, and it's easier to not fuss with a whole lot of detail. Now, the foreground down here, if you think of that as one shape, and some of it runs behind the trees, if you think of that as one shape, it's much easier to control detail, it's much easier to control color temperature. So I considered that one shape with a few darker accents running through it like that. Now look how the shapes overlap one another and create depth in the painting. These aspen trees here in the front overlap this part of this cow right here. They overlap some of the branches and the trees behind them. This group of cows overlap each other, giving depth to the painting. And the cows themselves overlap the trees in the background. The grass in the front overlaps the lower part of the cows. So if you think of how the shapes overlap one over another, that'll help you organize the painting into a more interesting composition. Now let's talk about hard and soft edges. If you look in the foreground, there's a lot of soft edges in here and not as many hard edges, and that's to kind of ease you into the painting. And up here in the top part of the painting, there's a nice combination of hard and soft edges, and some of this is created by values that are very close together. Looking at areas like this in the yellow-green, you can see brush strokes and very subtle little value changes, and that's another way of creating soft edges. You don't always have to just blur them with water or wet paint. You can do it by having values that are very close together. And if you look at some of the subtle painting on these aspen trees, there's little bits of color here and there, but it's very close in value to the white paper, and that creates a lot of soft edges. If you take one of the cows, let's take these two right here. There's a nice combination of hard and soft edges in their face. Some hard edges around here, and then as it gets up in here in the forehead, there's some softer edges and closer values which create softer edges. In this cow right here, there's some hard edges around the area of its nose and mouth, and then as you come up here onto its head, there's some softer edges, also closer values. And then coming down the side of its face, there's some nice combination of hard and soft edges. And in the cow, this cow over here in the body, there's a nice combination of hard and soft edges where the lighter part of the cow turns down into the darker, warmer area of the body. And if you look at some of these trees in the background, there's a real good example of how putting values that are close together creates some softer edges. So some of these trees kind of blend together and blend into the background because of that. Now there's some areas where the edges are sharp along the trees to define them more, and other areas like right here where there are softer edges where the trees kind of blend together. So it's a nice combination of those things. There's some harder edges in the cows like right here, and softer edges as you move out towards the edge of the painting, like this cow right here and these and back here, and that's very subtle, but it was deliberate. Some of these edges right in here get a little more blurred into the body and into the background and into the trees, and the same way over here. And then there's sharper edges which define these cows a little bit more and create a little more attention right there. It's very subtle, but it's something I did deliberately. And down here, this kind of broken line that runs along where the cows fade into the tall grass, that is a really interesting edge, and it skips along through the whole painting, and it's a combination of broken edges, scratched out grass, where I just scratched it out when it was wet, scratched it with my fingernail, colors bleeding into other colors to create soft edges. So it's a real nice combination of hard and soft edges. If it was a lot of hard edges across there, it would chop off the bottom of the painting. So that's one of the important edges in the painting, and you can see scratched out grass growing up through it. You can see a lot of broken parts like this right here, which create soft edges, and other areas where the paint actually blurs one into another. Now let's talk about brushwork. This painting was painted mainly with larger brushes, and you can see some visible brush strokes in here. There's one right there, for example, and you can see this all through the paintings, particularly in some of the areas of the cows. There are these bands around the aspen trees were just simple brush strokes, and you can see some of the brush strokes in the paintings or in the trees back in here. And I try to create a rhythm through the painting where you can see visible brush strokes from left to right and top to bottom and all through the painting. And to me, that just makes the painting that much more interesting and makes it look like a painting rather than a photograph. Let's talk about rich darks. All the darkest darks in this painting still have some color identity. For instance, if you look at this real dark color right here on the side of this cow, you can see a lot of brown in it, a little bit of blue, and even a little bit of dark violet. If I just use black out of the tube, you don't get any of those little nuances. And even in the background here, you can see some areas of perylene green running into colors like ultramarine blue and mineral violet. And if I don't stir those up, if I let them mix right on the paper, for example, then they have a richer quality that I can't get if I stir the colors up. There's dark areas through here, but they don't get muddy. They still have their color identity. You can see deep greens in there, for example, perylene green, and colors that have mixed with ultramarine blue and yellow ochre and cadmium yellow. But all the darks in this painting have color identity to them, where you can see several colors within the mixture. And if you just stir the color up and end up with a flat black, for example, it's not nearly as interesting as if you can see brown and blue and other colors in it. And green obviously is made up from yellow and blue, and if you can see little bits of yellow in there and then bits of blue and then the green that it mixes, it's much more interesting than just having flat green out of the tube. Now, the darker areas between the aspen trees that you can see that kind of skip along through here, those are negative shapes that move you back into the aspen forest. Typically, you wouldn't have the richest darks or the darkest darks in the back of the painting, but in this case, having darks back here between the aspen trees was really important, because it shows how as you go back into the aspen trees there's less and less sunlight coming through. So that's where I used some richer darks back in there. There's some darks in the foreground, but it's mainly middle values through there with accents of richer darks. And through the treetops here, there's rich darks in the corners like I talked about and over here, but those still have their identity of either perylene green or green mixed with dark blue and yellow. And you can see bits of blue and bits of yellow in there. And to me, that's much more exciting than just flat greens. One thing I want to emphasize when I'm working with darks and what I call rich darks, if I want to darken an area, like on this cow right here, I don't darken the whole thing. There's still some lighter areas showing through, and that keeps it from looking totally flat. So when I darken an area like I did back in here between the aspen trees, I only darken bits and pieces of it rather than the whole thing. And that gives it a little bit more depth, a little bit more of a painterly quality, which I like. Now let's talk about the effective use of white paper. There's actual white paper throughout this painting. You can see it on the aspen trees where there's no paint in some of those areas. On the faces of the cows, there's areas that are pure white paper with little bits of color around them. Some of the areas on the other faces, this right through here is pure white paper. There's even little sparks of white paper where the sunlight's coming through the trees, and where I've scratched out with my fingernail down here, that brought it back. Some of the grasses brought it back to just white paper as I scratched the color off. And planning where you're going to have white paper in the painting is really crucial, and you have to plan ahead, because once you get paint on it, even you can lift some of it out, you can wet it and lift it out, but it'll never be pure white again. So you really need to plan ahead, and I even marked some of this in the drawing with little pencil marks or notes before I started the painting. So I have made sure that I kept some of these areas as pure white paper. Now, there's always little bits of color in and around the white areas, even here and through here, and that just makes it sparkle that much more. But the white paper is precious, and you have to make sure that if you want something to be a bright white like that, like this up here or this here, that you plan ahead and you do not allow paint to get into that area. Now, if some of it does, then I just blot it out quickly with a tissue. There's a material called masket, which I don't use, misket, and you can cover white areas with it, let it dry, and then you can paint, and that area is protected, and you peel the material or the frisket off after that. I don't like it because it leaves edges that are too hard for me to deal with. So I really plan ahead on where I'm going to use or where I'm going to leave white paper. And now let's talk about the borders. There are 4 borders on the painting: left, right, top, and bottom. And it's good, you want to touch those borders with things in the painting. Like you can see here how this aspen tree comes up and connects to the top border and comes down and connects to the bottom border. That allows it to overlap other things in the painting, and it also brings the borders into play. If you look at the sides of the painting, they're cows that are cropped, like this one here and this one over here, and aspen trees that run off the borders like that. And that just makes the composition that much more interesting. There are leaves up here and branches which are obviously cropped, and down here along the bottom a lot of the grass is cropped by the border. But this just gives the effect that the painting continues beyond the borders. And if you want to see somebody who did this with great effect, look at Toulouse-Lautrec's work, particularly some of his figure studies, like in the Moulin Rouge, where he chopped and cropped different figures, and it just makes the compositions that much more interesting. Now let's talk about color temperature. If you look in the top of the trees, and I mentioned this before, but I used a lot of warmer colors up here, predominantly yellow greens, and that was to show the sunlight coming through. And then down here in the bottom, there's cooler temperature, more blue in the green, and just a cooler, softer area in the grass down there. And then throughout the painting, in the areas of the faces, for example, there's combinations of cerulean blue and violet and yellow ochre, so different temperatures of colors there. There are pinks that are mixed with cobalt violet and yellow ochre to create some different temperatures in there. Even these areas where they're very, very warm in the bodies of the cows, there's still little bits of cool colors like blue and violet in there. So it's a nice combination of warm and cool colors. And I decide, like this is a very warm area, this cow is mostly warm colors, but I always put little accents of cool colors in there, like these violets and blues in the face, so that it's not all predominantly warm. And I do the same thing in an area where I'm using mostly cool colors. There's still little bits of warm colors in here. There's some of the reds coming down from the cows and some of the other warmer greens, but even though it's predominantly cool colors in the foreground, I still have little bits of warm colors running through there. Now let's talk about artistic decisions. This is something it's not a technique like brushwork or mixing colors. It's more of an opportunity to use your imagination and put your own personality into the painting. And whether you realize it or not, we all have the ability to do this. And if you want good examples, just look at children's art. They're so full of imagination and they're just wonderful. And kids have that innate ability to do that, and it's something we need to try to recreate as adults, especially in painting. And this is one of the things that will change your artwork from just being a painting into actually being a work of art. And that's because each of us has a different personality, and if you look through art history, the artists who put more of themselves, more of their own feelings, like Vincent van Gogh, into their paintings, they're the ones that are remembered, and they're the ones that people write about, and they're the ones that changed art and the world of art forever. Some examples of artistic decisions is the pictures that I took, that I worked from, and I probably worked from a dozen different photographs that I took. All the cows were pretty much equal as far as hard edges and being clearly shown in the photographs. But I chose this cow and this little group right here to be more defined, and as you move away from them, like here and over here, they're more, there's less definition and more blurred colors and blurred areas and soft edges. And the same thing over here and over here. So as you move away from what I consider the more important area of the painting, here and here, you get more blurred colors and less definition and less detail. And that was just a decision that I made. Another decision I made when I was painting this area down in here, I had a lot more warm colors in it, and it just didn't work with the rest of the painting. So I wet this whole area, and I scratched through it with laid a razor blade on its side and just scratched out as much of the color as I could without damaging the paper. And then I blotted it, I wet it again and blotted it, and took it down to almost white paper again. There were still derivatives of color on there, but then I painted these cooler greens on top of that. And because there were derivatives of the early colors on there, and I put these cooler greens on top of it, it created a softness and a depth that I couldn't have gotten in any other way. And also, and one of the other artistic decisions I made was I wanted the cows to have personality, kind of a curious look, like they were wondering what the hell I was doing as I was walking up there with my camera. So I tried to get personality in the cows. Like this one back here looks like he's very suspicious. This one here looks like she's staring right at you, kind of surprised. This one has a little more of a surprised look. That's just one of the things I really worked on in the painting. I wanted to give each of those cows some personality. Another one of my artistic decisions was how I arranged the cows in the painting, because I had a lot of different pictures to work from and drawings, so it was up to me how I was going to place them in here. So I put this cow kind of by itself, so it would appear important, and then the rest of them I tried to group. Like this is one group right here, this is another group over here, and that just kind of pulls the painting together and makes some areas more interesting or more important than other areas. Another thing that I think of as an artistic decision is how much gray I use in the painting. If you look through the trees, for example, there's a lot of different grays, and they're all mixed. They're never right out of the tube. There's blue gray and violet gray and warm gray and cool gray. And I use grays to really show off the richer colors in the painting. If you look at this area, for example, there's some nice, pretty grays coming down through here that really show off the warmer colors in this cow, for example. And the same way over here, as this tree comes down and gets darker grays, that shows off the white head and face of this cow. And the same way over here. And I like to use grays to do that, because if you're not careful, the colors become very muddy. And so I think of temperature, warm and cool grays, and the different components of the grays that you can see in there, rather than using muddy color. And there are some areas of this painting that are much more abstract than other areas. These areas down here are very defined, but as you look at areas like this, and even some of the cow faces back in here, taken by itself, that's a very abstract area, not nearly as defined. And the same thing over here on this side of the painting. There's the way the trees run together and the way the leaves come down on them and so forth. Those areas are a little bit more abstract. So I try to have some areas that are more abstract and other areas that are more defined. Now I want to talk about the three areas of the painting: background, middle ground, and foreground. If you can learn to look at landscapes in terms of background, middle ground, and foreground, it can really help you make decisions, on shapes and colors and so forth. And it just clarifies in your mind how to compose the whole painting. So the background is these very distant trees back in the forest, and the middle ground is typically where I have more action, more color changes, more hard and soft edges, more combinations of warm and cool colors, just a little bit more personality in that part of the painting. The middle ground is usually where you're going to find the most excitement. It's where if you have focal point or more than one focal point, that's usually in the middle ground like that. And then there's the foreground, which in this case is just the grass down here and some of these bigger aspen trees right in the front. And in the foreground, I try to use some bigger shapes like these aspen trees against smaller shapes like the little blades of grass. That just makes the foreground that much more interesting. In the middle ground, again, I use bigger shapes, smaller shapes, more detail, more rich colors, anything like that to make the middle ground more interesting. Typically in the background, in this area through here, you wouldn't use rich darks like that. But in this case I did, because I wanted it to look like you were going back into the aspen forest. If you were painting an open field or a ranch scene, for example, where you had mountains in the background and so forth, you would use closer values back in there and not big value jumps like I have between these trees and the background colors, the negative shapes. But in this case, I thought that worked for this painting because you're looking back into a forest rather than across an open area. So we've covered a lot of information as I've talked about this painting, but I thought it would be interesting just to go through a painting like this and talk about it from top to bottom and left to right and all the different components of it. So think about these things as you do your own paintings. Look at the video again, and until next time, this is Dennis Pendleton saying, keep on painting.